The jungle exploded with sound that night, a cacophony of screaming voices, crackling gunfire, and something far more primal. The guttural roar of hundreds of men charging towards certain death with weapons raised and voices united in a single terrifying cry. This was Saipan in the summer of 1944, and what happened there would change the face of warfare forever. For years, these Banzai Charges had been the nightmare that haunted every Allied soldier in the Pacific. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry advancing with a resolve that seemed to transcend human fear. Bayonets gleaming in the moonlight, faces twisted with determination, rushing forward even as their comrades fell around them. These charges had broken enemy lines across the Pacific Islands. They had shattered the morale of seasoned troops, and they had turned battle after battle into scenes of chaos and carnage that defied conventional military logic. But on this particular night, on this particular island, they encountered something completely new. An American weapon that didn't fire bullets or drop shells. Something that could erase an entire charge in a matter of seconds and turn the jungle itself into an inescapable inferno. As United States Marines dug into defensive positions along the volcanic ridges of Saipan, some of them carried equipment that had just arrived from laboratories half a world away. The M2 Flamethrower, a device that was heavy, primitive, dangerously unpredictable, and yet absolutely devastating in ways that conventional weapons could never match. When the Japanese troops broke from cover that night, screaming across open ground in what they believed would be an overwhelming assault, Marine operators unleashed jets of liquid fire that reached 30 yards through the darkness, coating everything they touched in flames that stuck like glue and burned with an intensity that turned night into day. Trees ignited instantly, the air filled with the acrid smell of burning oil and flesh, and the very atmosphere seemed to roar with heat. In those moments, all the old rules of warfare, the concepts of courage and honor, the traditions of blade-to-blade combat and warrior codes that had defined battles for centuries, all of it vanished under the terrible roar of liquid fire that consumed everything in its path. For the first time in the Pacific Campaign, fear shifted sides. The legendary Japanese fighting spirit, the Banzai courage that had terrorized Allied forces for years, met a weapon that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be impressed by determination, and didn't miss. The dense jungle that Japanese forces had used as cover and concealment became their enemy, amplifying the flames, trapping the heat, and turning what should have been an advantage into a death sentence. To understand what made this moment so significant, you need to step back and look at the brutal pattern that had emerged across every major Pacific Island campaign before Saipan. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Peleliu, American forces encountered the same horrifying reality over and over again. Japanese soldiers who truly believed that surrender meant eternal shame, who strapped grenades to their bodies and charged into machine gun fire, who transformed every cave and bunker into a tomb they were willing to die defending. The Banzai Charge wasn't just a military tactic, it was the physical manifestation of Bushido, the ancient samurai warrior code that promised honor in death and disgrace in defeat. Japanese officers reinforced this mindset by telling their men that American forces tortured prisoners, that capture meant humiliation worse than death, that the only path to glory ran straight through enemy lines with a weapon in hand and a battle cry on their lips. And so they charged, sometimes hundreds at a time, sometimes thousands, voices rising in unison as they rushed forward with an intensity that shattered the psychological defenses of even the most experienced soldiers. American forces had firepower, certainly. They had rifles and machine guns and artillery that could tear through human bodies with mechanical efficiency. But nothing in their training prepared young Marines for the visceral horror of watching hundreds of screaming men run directly into streams of bullets without hesitation, faces contorted with rage and religious fervor, refusing to stop even as the soldiers beside them were cut down. Some Marines broke under that pressure, others froze in shock, because the Banzai Charge was designed to be as much a weapon of psychological terror as a military maneuver, overwhelming defenders not just with numbers but with the sheer incomprehensible willingness to die. By early 1944, United States military command realized that conventional tactics weren't enough anymore. Yes, machine guns and artillery could kill the charging soldiers. They could pile bodies 6 deep in front of defensive positions, but they couldn't stop the charge itself, couldn't break the psychological momentum that made these attacks so effective at sowing chaos and fear. The solution emerged from an unexpected source. Chemical engineers and weapons designers working in research facilities thousands of miles from any combat zone. Men who were experimenting with something ancient yet revolutionary, the weaponization of fire itself. Flamethrowers weren't a new concept. German forces had deployed them during World War I. Crude contraptions that shot burning liquid across muddy trenches with mixed results. But those early designs were unreliable. They were almost as dangerous to the operators as they were to enemy soldiers. And they had such limited range that using them often meant certain death for whoever carried them. The United States military saw potential in the basic concept, but they needed something far more sophisticated, something that a single Marine could carry through dense jungle terrain and deploy effectively in the chaotic conditions of Pacific Island warfare. What they developed was designated the M2 Flamethrower, and it represented a significant leap forward in portable incendiary technology. The device consisted of 3 main components that worked together in a carefully balanced system. To cylindrical fuel tanks that strapped onto the operator's back like a heavy backpack. A separate nitrogen pressure tank that provided the force to propel the fuel. And a handheld nozzle equipped with an ignition system that could be triggered at will. The fuel itself was a revolutionary mixture. Gasoline that had been chemically thickened with a newly developed compound called napalm, which made the burning liquid stick to whatever surface it touched, whether that was wood, metal, cloth, or human skin, and burn longer, hotter, and with a horrifying persistence that water couldn't easily extinguish. When fully loaded, the M2 weighed 70 pounds, making it one of the heaviest pieces of equipment an individual Marine would carry into combat. It could shoot a continuous stream of fire up to 30 yards, which doesn't sound like much compared to the range of rifles or machine guns. But in the close quarters fighting of jungle warfare, 30 yards was more than enough. The device held sufficient fuel for approximately 7 seconds of continuous use. And while 7 seconds might seem like an insignificant amount of time in the context of actual combat, 7 seconds of liquid fire represented an eternity of destruction that could fundamentally alter the outcome of an engagement. Training Marines to operate the M2 was an extraordinarily delicate process that required careful psychological preparation as much as technical instruction. The weapon was inherently dangerous to the person carrying it. A single stray bullet penetrating one of the fuel tanks could transform the operator into a human torch in an instant. The weight of the equipment threw off normal balance and movement patterns, and the visible jet of flame that the weapon produced gave away the operator's position to every enemy soldier in the vicinity. Beyond the physical dangers, there was a profound psychological element to operating a flamethrower that set it apart from every other weapon in the Marine arsenal. Shooting someone with a rifle happens at a distance. It's impersonal in a way that makes it psychologically easier to process. but burning people alive with jellied gasoline, hearing their screams, smelling the results. That required a different kind of mental fortitude that not every soldier possessed. Yet the specific conditions of Pacific theater combat demanded exactly this kind of weapon. Japanese defenders had become experts at fortifying themselves in caves, concrete bunkers, and heavily camouflaged positions that conventional artillery couldn't effectively reach. They would hide in vegetation so dense that rifle fire was essentially useless. They would dig tunnel systems so extensive that clearing them with traditional assault tactics cost hundreds of American lives for every 100 yards gained. Military commanders needed a weapon that could clear cave systems without requiring Marines to enter them in close combat. Something that could cut through jungle vegetation like a scythe. Something that could break not just enemy lines, but the enemy's fundamental willingness to continue fighting. By the middle of 1944, specialized flamethrower units were being integrated into Marine battalions throughout the Pacific Combat Zone. These operators trained at dedicated facilities where they learned to move while carrying the cumbersome equipment, how to aim the arcing stream of fire for maximum effect, and how to coordinate their movements with rifle squads who would provide covering fire and protection from enemy snipers who had learned to target anyone carrying the distinctive backpack-fueled tanks. Every operator understood that they were walking bullseyes. Japanese soldiers quickly figured out that shooting the men with tanks on their backs was the most effective way to neutralize the flamethrower threat. But what the Japanese military didn't yet comprehend was just how tactically effective these weapons would prove to be under the right conditions. Saipan represented a strategic prize of incalculable value to both sides. This narrow island, just 15 miles long, sitting in the Marianas Islands chain approximately 1,500 miles from Tokyo, was within bombing range of the Japanese home islands, and everyone involved in planning understood the implications. If American forces could capture Saipan and establish air bases there, the newly deployed B-29 Superfortress bombers could launch sustained strategic bombing campaigns directly against Japan's industrial centers, oil refineries, and military production facilities. The Japanese High Command understood these stakes perfectly, which is why they fortified Saipan with more than 31,000 troops, extensive artillery emplacements, and elaborate defensive networks that had been carved into the island's volcanic limestone cliffs over months of preparation. The American invasion commenced on June 15, 1944, with 8,000 Marines landing on the beaches in the first assault wave, immediately encountering devastating artillery and machine gun fire that turned the shallow water red with blood. Despite the horrific casualties, the Marines pushed inland yard by bloody yard, establishing defensive positions and slowly expanding their beachhead despite fierce resistance at every step. But Japanese commanders had learned from previous battles, they had studied American tactics, and they had developed a plan that had proven effective on other islands. They would wait until darkness provided cover. Then they would launch the largest Banzai Charge ever attempted in the entire Pacific War. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers who had been given extra rations of sake to fuel their courage and final speeches from their officers about the honor of dying for the emperor, overwhelming the American positions through sheer numerical superiority and fanatical determination. Officers distributed grenades, soldiers sharpened their bayonets to razor edges, and final letters were written home knowing they would never be sent. As darkness settled over the island, the Marines dug deeper into their fighting positions, checking ammunition, supplies, and adjusting fields of fire, knowing from intelligence reports and battlefield experience that something terrible was coming their way. They had heard the stories from other islands, they had seen photographs of the aftermath of previous Banzai charges, they understood what they were about to face. But this time, something was different. Scattered among the rifle companies, integrated into defensive positions at strategic points along the marine lines, were men carrying M2 Flamethrowers. And this time, when the charge came, the jungle itself was about to become a weapon. The Banzai Charge began just after midnight on July 7, 1944, starting as a distant sound that might have been mistaken for wind through the trees. A low rhythmic chanting that gradually grew louder and more distinct. Then came the unmistakable rustling of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of men moving through dense jungle vegetation toward the American positions. Then the screaming started, voices rising in unison crying "Banzai, Banzai," which literally meant 10,000 years, a traditional wish for the emperor's eternal reign, but which in the context of battle had become a death cry that chilled the blood of everyone who heard it. Illumination flares shot into the night sky, their bright magnesium light turning the darkness into a stuttering, artificial daylight that revealed a sight that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers were emerging from the tree line at full sprint, bayonets fixed to their rifles, some carrying only swords or sharpened bamboo spears, others clutching grenades against their chests. Officers led from the front waving traditional samurai sabers above their heads, and behind them came even the wounded from previous days' fighting, some hobbling forward on improvised crutches, determined to participate in this final glorious assault rather than die in a hospital bed. American machine guns opened fire immediately, tracer rounds crisscrossing the darkness in brilliant streams of light, artillery shells beginning to explode among the charging ranks with devastating effect. Men fell by the dozens, bodies tumbling forward or blown apart by high explosives, but the charge didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, didn't break formation. This was the recurring nightmare that haunted every Marine who had fought in the Pacific. The terrifying reality of facing overwhelming numbers driven by suicidal courage, knowing that if the defensive line broke even slightly, hand-to-hand combat would begin and survival would become a matter of luck more than skill. And then, from 3 different points along the American defensive perimeter, jets of brilliant orange fire erupted into the darkness like dragon's breath made real. The first flamethrower operator was a 19-year-old private from Ohio named James Harding who had trained for 6 weeks on the weapon but had never fired it at a living human being. Now, watching this wall of screaming soldiers materializing from the smoke and darkness, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely maintain his grip on the nozzle assembly. His assigned spotter, crouched in the foxhole beside him, shouted over the roar of gunfire, "Now! Hit them now!" Harding squeezed the trigger mechanism, and pressurized nitrogen forced the napalm mixture through the nozzle where a pilot light ignited it instantly. A stream of liquid fire erupted from his position, arcing through the air for 30 yards before splashing across the charging mass of soldiers with catastrophic effect. The napalm didn't just burn, it adhered, coating uniforms and skin and vegetation with jellied fire that couldn't be brushed off or shaken away. Soldiers caught directly in the stream became living torches, their screams cutting through even the tremendous noise of battle, their silhouettes writhing in agony as the fire consumed them. Other soldiers nearby tried instinctively to help, to beat out the flames on their comrades' bodies, only to catch fire themselves and add to the spreading inferno. The dense jungle vegetation that Japanese forces had planned to use as concealment ignited like kindling, creating walls of flame that blocked entire avenues of approach and forced the charge to funnel into narrower killing zones where machine gun fire became even more effective. The smell that spread across the battlefield was indescribable, a nauseating mixture of burning fuel, burning wood, and burning human flesh that would embed itself in the memories of everyone present. But incredibly, horrifyingly, the charge didn't stop completely. Japanese soldiers ran around the flames, some even attempted to run through them, stepping over the bodies of burning comrades. Driven forward by a combination of sake-fueled courage, military discipline, and the absolute certainty that retreat meant dishonor worse than death, they kept coming, bayonets thrust forward, voices still screaming that single word that had become synonymous with terror across the Pacific Islands. Harding's 7 seconds of fuel ran out, leaving his hands trembling as he dropped the nozzle and grabbed for his rifle with fingers that no longer seemed fully under his control. Across the defensive line, other flamethrower operators were opening fire, each burst creating a new pocket of hell, each stream of fire cutting through the darkness and turning portions of the battlefield into scenes that resembled medieval conceptions of damnation. The M2's 30-yard range meant that operators could engage the charging soldiers before they could close to bayonet distance, filling that crucial gap where Banzai Charges traditionally became most deadly with a wall of fire that nothing living could cross. But the weapon had severe limitations that became immediately apparent in actual combat conditions. 70 pounds of equipment made operators slow and clumsy, turning them into easy targets for any Japanese soldier with a clear line of sight. Enemy riflemen learned within minutes to focus their fire on the distinctive silhouettes of men with cylindrical tanks strapped to their backs. Bullets pinged off the metal cylinders with ringing impacts, some ricocheting harmlessly into the night, but others penetrated the tank walls. And when a fuel tank was breached while the weapon was in operation, the results were instantaneous and absolutely horrific. The operator and everyone within several yards became an explosion of liquid fire that consumed everything it touched, creating casualties that were difficult even for experienced combat medics to look at. Marine rifle squads quickly adapted their tactics, forming protective screens around the flamethrower teams, creating a brutal but effective ballet of coordinated violence. Riflemen would engage distant targets while flamethrower operators dealt with threats at close range, each supporting the other in a pattern that had to be maintained perfectly because any break in coordination could result in the entire position being overrun. The Banzai Charge reached the American defensive line in several locations despite the withering fire. Japanese soldiers leapt directly into foxholes, swinging swords and bayonets in combat that was brutal, primal, and decided by inches and seconds rather than tactics or strategy. Men fought with knives, with rifle butts, with their bare hands when weapons were lost, combat that reduced warfare to its most primitive and savage essence. But wherever flamethrowers were actively operating, the defensive line held firm. The fire created physical barriers that channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. It broke up the cohesion of massed formations. And perhaps most importantly, from a tactical perspective, it shattered the psychological momentum that made Banzai Charges effective as a terror weapon. Private James Harding survived that night, his hands still shaking hours after the fighting ended, but to other flamethrower operators in his company weren't as fortunate. One took a rifle round directly through his fuel tank while actively spraying fire and was immolated instantly along with his spotter, dying so quickly they likely never felt pain. Another operator was overrun when a group of Japanese soldiers exploited a gap in the defensive line and flanked his position from an unexpected angle. His body was discovered at dawn, still clutching the empty flamethrower nozzle in a death grip, surrounded by more than a dozen enemy corpses. evidence that even after his fuel ran out, he had fought with every weapon available until he was overwhelmed. The larger Banzai Charge continued for nearly 2 hours, wave after wave crashing against the marine defensive positions like ocean breakers against a rocky shore. Each assault growing progressively weaker as casualties mounted and coordination deteriorated. Military historians estimate that the attacking force numbered over 3,000 Japanese soldiers, making it the largest single-mass suicide attack of the entire Pacific War. A final desperate gamble to break the American invasion before it could establish an uncheckable foothold on the island. By the time the last attacks petered out in the pre-dawn darkness, American forces had suffered over 400 casualties, a number that would have been far higher without the strategic placement of flamethrower teams. But Japanese losses were absolutely catastrophic. More than 2,500 soldiers dead, their bodies literally carpeting the ground in front of the Marine lines in some areas, stacked so deep that visibility was obstructed and movement became difficult. The flamethrowers hadn't single-handedly stopped the charge. Artillery and machine guns and coordinated rifle fire had done the majority of the actual killing, but the flamethrowers had accomplished something far more strategically significant than simply adding to the body count. They had broken the mystique. For years, Banzai Charges had been effective primarily because they were psychologically overwhelming, because they exploited the deeply embedded human instinct to flee from large numbers of charging enemies, because they created chaos and panic that fractured defensive cohesion. Fire completely reversed that psychological equation. It created a barrier that was more terrifying than the charge itself, something that inspired more primal fear than even suicidal determination could overcome. After the Battle of Saipan, Japanese commanders across the Pacific theater began to seriously question whether Banzai Charges remained a viable military tactic against an opponent equipped with this new weapon. American forces, meanwhile, began to depend on flamethrowers for virtually every subsequent island assault, recognizing that they had stumbled upon a tactical advantage that fundamentally altered the calculus of Pacific combat. The success at Saipan led directly to rapid deployment of additional flamethrower units throughout the theater. By August 1944, every Marine division operating in the Pacific had at least one dedicated flamethrower platoon, and the weapon had proven itself invaluable for clearing the elaborate cave systems and interconnected bunker networks that characterized Japanese defensive strategy on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, flamethrower operators became arguably the most crucial soldiers on the entire battlefield. Mount Suribachi and the island's volcanic landscape were honeycombed with tunnels and fortified positions that had been connected into a defensive network of staggering sophistication. Conventional artillery couldn't reach these positions. Grenades had minimal effect against concrete reinforcement and volcanic rock, and attempting to clear them with infantry assaults meant unacceptable casualty rates. But flamethrowers could spray liquid fire deep into cave openings, and the fire did more than just burn. It consumed oxygen, creating a vacuum effect that sucked air out of connected chambers and suffocated defenders who were far beyond the reach of the flames themselves. The tactic was undeniably brutal, but it was effective in ways that nothing else available to American forces could match. Flamethrower teams would approach a cave entrance under heavy covering fire from supporting infantry, position themselves at angles that minimized their exposure to defensive fire from inside the cave, then unleash sustained bursts of flame directly into the opening. The fire didn't just kill through burning, it created a complex cascade of effects. Superheated air rushed deep into the tunnel systems, Oxygen was consumed faster than the limited ventilation could replace it, and soldiers deep inside the complexes died from asphyxiation long before the actual flames ever reached their positions. But the human cost on both sides of these operations was absolutely staggering in ways that statistics struggle to capture. Flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima had a life expectancy that could be measured in minutes during active assaults. They were priority targets for every Japanese defender who could see them, and the nature of cave clearing meant approaching fixed defensive positions that had been specifically designed to kill attacking infantry. Japanese defenders, meanwhile, faced a choice that no military code or warrior tradition had prepared them for: remain in the caves and burn or suffocate to death, or emerge into the open where American machine guns waited to cut them down the moment they appeared. Neither option offered anything resembling an honorable death or a fighting chance at survival. The true strategic revelation came after the battle ended, when Marine commanders conducted detailed analysis of the effectiveness of different weapons systems in achieving mission objectives. The data that emerged from these after-action reports was startling and would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. In cave-clearing operations specifically, flamethrowers achieved objective completion rates exceeding 80% while simultaneously reducing friendly casualties by more than half, compared to conventional assault methods that relied on grenades and close-quarters rifle fire. One properly supported flamethrower team could neutralize a fortified position that would otherwise require hours of fighting and potentially dozens of casualties. But the weapon's impact extended far beyond mere statistical analysis of tactical effectiveness. It fundamentally changed Japanese defensive doctrine across the entire theater of operations. After Saipan, large-scale Banzai charges became increasingly rare to the point of near extinction. Japanese commanders had realized through bitter experience that mass frontal assaults against an enemy equipped with flamethrowers was functionally equivalent to ordering men to march into a furnace, achieving nothing except wasteful deaths that served no strategic purpose. Instead, Japanese forces shifted comprehensively to defensive warfare, making American attackers pay for every single inch of territory with elaborate minefields, carefully planned ambushes, and deeply fortified positions that maximized American casualties even in defeat. This doctrinal shift, ironically and tragically, made the Pacific War even bloodier and more protracted than it might otherwise have been. Rather than decisive, if horrifying, Banzai charges that could be repelled in a single chaotic engagement, American forces now faced grinding attrition warfare that consumed lives steadily and remorselessly. The flamethrower evolved from a weapon designed to counter mass attacks into an essential tool for methodical, systematic destruction of defensive networks. Every cave on every island, every concrete bunker, every fortified house in Okinawa's civilian towns, all of them faced the same ultimate fate: a sustained stream of jellied fire that left nothing alive inside and nothing structurally intact outside. The weapon that had stopped the charges became the weapon that burned entire islands clean of resistance, meter by meter, position by position, with relentless mechanical efficiency. Fire had become not just a weapon, but the defining signature of American warfare in the Pacific theater, the tool that American forces relied upon more than any other to break Japanese resistance. The psychological impact of flamethrower warfare on both sides cannot possibly be overstated or fully captured in historical analysis. For Japanese soldiers, the flamethrower represented something that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare as they understood it. It was a weapon that denied them even the basic dignity of death in combat as their traditions defined it. burning alive, unable to fight back effectively, trapped in confined spaces with no honorable path forward. This was not the glorious death that Bushido philosophy had promised to warriors who stood their ground against the enemy. Documents captured from Japanese positions and translated after the war revealed that ordinary soldiers feared flamethrowers more than any other weapon in the American arsenal, more than the devastating naval bombardments, more than aerial bombing, more than tanks or artillery. For American Marines who operated the M2, the experience created its own unique moral burden that many carried for the rest of their lives. Killing with rifles or machine guns happens at a distance that provides some psychological insulation. But burning people alive, hearing their screams echo across the battlefield, smelling the results of what you had done, these experiences left psychological scars that were fundamentally different from the trauma associated with conventional weapons. Post-war interviews and psychological studies revealed that flamethrower veterans suffered disproportionately high rates of combat trauma, recurring nightmares, and profound guilt that sometimes lasted for decades after the war ended. Yet military commanders at every level justified the weapons used through the stark utilitarian logic of total war. Each cave system cleared with fire meant fewer Marines required to enter those caves in close combat where casualties were virtually guaranteed. Each Banzai Charge broken by flame meant dozens of American lives preserved. The moral calculus was cold and brutal, but from a purely military perspective it was also undeniably clear. Burning enemy soldiers was more efficient and cost fewer American lives than bleeding your own men to death in grinding frontal assaults or cave-clearing operations. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the M2 Flamethrower had become synonymous with Pacific combat in the public imagination and in military planning. Iconic photographs of Marines silhouetted against brilliant streams of orange fire became some of the most recognizable images of the entire war. Fire had evolved from a tactical expedient into comprehensive strategy. Fire had become the tool of victory itself. The final and perhaps most troubling historical irony emerged during the planning stages for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands that was scheduled to commence in November 1945. American military planners, working with the assumption that every Japanese city, town, and village would become a fortress defended by civilians as well as military forces, anticipated using flamethrowers on a scale that dwarfed anything seen on the Pacific Islands. Not just portable M2 units carried by infantry, but tank-mounted flamethrower systems, aircraft-delivered napalm bombing campaigns, and entire specialized flamethrower battalions that would operate as independent tactical units. Military analysts preparing casualty estimates for Operation Downfall projected American deaths ranging from hundreds of thousands to well over 1 million servicemen, with Japanese civilian casualties potentially reaching into the tens of millions once urban warfare began. The flamethrower, originally developed as a tactical solution to stop Banzai charges on isolated jungle islands, would have become the primary weapon for urban warfare across an entire industrialized nation. The same fire that had stopped that charge at Saipan on a single summer night in 1944 would have swept through Tokyo's wooden neighborhoods, through Osaka's industrial districts, through Kyoto's ancient temples and irreplaceable cultural heritage sites. Everything would have burned, military targets and civilian homes alike, because in total war waged on that scale, such distinctions become meaningless abstractions. The atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 rendered Operation Downfall unnecessary and prevented the flamethrower. apocalypse that military planners had been preparing to unleash. Japan surrendered before American Flamethrower teams ever set foot on the home islands. But the atomic bombs themselves represented, in a very real sense, the ultimate evolutionary endpoint of what the M2 had pioneered: fire as an absolute weapon. Destruction so complete and overwhelming that resistance becomes physically impossible and psychologically meaningless. The weapon that had changed tactical warfare in the Pacific had unknowingly foreshadowed the strategic weapons that would end the war and reshape global geopolitics for generations. When the war finally ended, the M2 Flamethrower was quietly retired from frontline service with minimal ceremony or acknowledgement. The weapon had served its grim purpose with undeniable effectiveness. But post-war America wasn't particularly eager to celebrate or memorialize a device whose primary function had been burning human beings alive. While rifles, tanks, and fighter aircraft were preserved as museum pieces and celebrated in victory parades, flamethrowers were generally stored away in military depots, their tactical contributions downplayed or omitted from official histories. Their operators rarely invited to speak about their wartime experiences at public events. The men who had operated these weapons rarely spoke about what they had done, even to family members, even decades later when the war had receded into history. The physical scars that flamethrower warfare left on the Pacific Islands remained visible for many decades after the fighting ended. On Saipan, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, the volcanic rock faces still showed black scorch marks where caves had been systematically cleared with liquid fire. The vegetation patterns revealed where sections of jungle had been burned away completely, creating ecological scars that took decades to heal. And in the memories of survivors on both sides, American and Japanese alike, the smell of napalm and burning flesh lingered with disturbing persistence long after the actual flames had died. Japanese veterans who were interviewed by historians decades after the war ended still described the flamethrower with a complex mixture of fear and grudging respect. It was, they said repeatedly, the weapon that made them understand with absolute certainty that the war was lost. That traditional concepts of military honor and warrior courage were no longer relevant in modern mechanized warfare. When fire itself could be deployed as a tactical weapon, when the jungle and caves that should have provided protection became death traps, when courage and determination couldn't overcome basic chemistry and physics, traditional warrior codes meant nothing at all. Courage couldn't defeat combustion, honor couldn't stop the oxygen from being consumed, and fighting spirit was irrelevant when facing a weapon that operated according to the immutable laws of thermodynamics. For American veterans, the legacy of the flamethrower was infinitely more complicated and morally ambiguous. They had done what military necessity demanded. They had used the tools that were available to achieve victory and save the lives of their fellow soldiers. But necessary didn't automatically mean easy to live with or accept. The weapon that had undeniably saved their lives and the lives of their comrades had simultaneously cost them pieces of their humanity that could never be fully recovered. Today, more than 7 decades after the end of World War II, the M2 Flamethrower exists primarily in military museums, in specialized historical texts, and in the fading memories of the few surviving veterans who witnessed it in action. But its impact on warfare was profound and lasting in ways that continue to influence military doctrine and weapons development. It demonstrated conclusively that psychological weapons could be just as tactically decisive as raw firepower, that breaking an enemy's will to continue fighting mattered at least as much as breaking their actual military formations, It proved that in the context of total war waged between industrialized nations, traditional concepts of honor and proper combat became luxuries that neither side could afford to maintain. The Banzai Charges that had terrorized American Marines in 1942 and 1943 were effectively extinct as a tactical concept by 1945. Replaced by defensive warfare that made the Pacific Campaign even bloodier and more protracted, but also more predictable and less psychologically devastating. The Flamethrower didn't just stop individual charges, it fundamentally changed how modern wars would be fought throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. From Vietnam's napalm strikes that cleared jungle vegetation and enemy positions alike, to modern thermobaric weapons that create devastating pressure waves and consume oxygen, to contemporary discussions about the ethics of using white phosphorus in urban warfare, the underlying principle has remained constant across decades. Fire dominates physical space in ways that projectile weapons simply cannot match. It denies terrain to the enemy. It creates psychological effects that conventional weapons struggle to replicate. And it forces defenders to make impossible choices between equally terrible outcomes. But perhaps the deepest and most uncomfortable legacy of the M2 Flamethrower is fundamentally moral rather than tactical. It forced both sides in the Pacific War to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of modern industrialized warfare. That there are no clean weapons, no methods of killing that preserve honor or dignity. Only victory and defeat, survival and annihilation. The Flamethrower stripped away any remaining romantic notions about combat, revealing warfare as fundamentally a contest of applied violence where the side willing and able to inflict the most devastating destruction would ultimately prevail. The weapon made it impossible to pretend that war could be conducted according to gentlemanly rules or ancient codes of conduct, because when nations commit to total war, when entire populations are mobilized for industrial-scale conflict, the only metric that matters is effectiveness, and moral considerations become casualties just as surely as the soldiers on both sides. The jungle stopped burning many decades ago, the scorch marks have faded, the veterans have grown old and passed away, the M2 Flamethrowers have been decommissioned and locked away in storage or put on display behind museum glass, but the fundamental questions that this weapon raised about the acceptable costs of victory, about the psychological price that warriors pay when they employ weapons that operate beyond traditional boundaries of combat, about whether technological effectiveness can ever justify moral compromise. These questions continue to burn as brightly as the flames that swept across Saipan on that summer night in 1944. Every weapon that followed, every advancement in military technology, every new method of delivering death with greater efficiency, all of them trace their philosophical lineage back to that moment when fire became strategy and the old rules of warfare burned away forever. The men who fought at Saipan, who faced the Banzai Charges and unleashed the flames in response, who survived that night and carried its memory for the rest of their lives, they understood something profound that the rest of us can only glimpse through historical documentation and preserved testimony. They understood that in the end, war reduces everything to its most basic elements, survival or death, victory or defeat, and that the weapons we create to ensure our survival inevitably change us in ways we can never fully anticipate or control. The Flamethrower at Saipan didn't just stop a charge, it marked the moment when modern warfare crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, when the pursuit of victory consumed the last vestiges of restraint, and when fire became not just a tool, but a metaphor for the consuming nature of total war itself. That night, under the tropical stars, as the jungle burned and men screamed and the ancient warrior codes met the realities of 20th century weapons technology, history took a breath and changed direction forever, the weapon that stopped. The Banzai Charge became a symbol of something far larger than tactical innovation. It became evidence that in the modern age, no force of will or determination, no matter how culturally rooted or psychologically powerful, can ultimately withstand the cold logic of technological superiority. And in that realization, both terrifying and illuminating, lies the true legacy of what happened when fire met fury on a small volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from home, in the summer of 1944.